This is GC Radio 101 FM. This is where music and the word come alive.
Alex is our
Can I
is
do
our
easy?
No, yes, you can.
Yes, you
Yes,
can.
you
Yes, you can. All right, my friends. The gluten-free cookbook for two. These are great recipes. Anybody, no matter if you're gluten-free or not, you're going to want to make these. We love the local. Please support your local food growers and food makers. And for on-demand podcast delivery of this Food Schmooze Party every week and all of our curated recommendations for food, wine, cocktails, restaurants, all kinds of stuff. Go to foodschmooze.org and we'll be right back.
I feel good. I knew that I would now. I feel good. I knew that I would now.
This is the Food Schmooze Party, offering the richness of life and coming to you in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New York, including Westchester County, the east end of Long Island. Of course, that includes the Hamptons. The senior producer is Robin Doyon-Aiken, and to hear this show on WNPR, it airs Thursdays at 3 and Saturdays at noon. Podcasts and our curated recommendations are always online at foodschmooze.org. Okay, here we go. This is kind of fun because Carol Fenster has written 11 cookbooks. You might remember that she's done this book called 1,000 Gluten-Free Recipes. She's contributed to Washington Post, New York Times, lives in Colorado. This is a very important book for people who are gluten-free or who have friends who are gluten-free and want to make the meal for everyone at the table, including the gluten-free person. So the gluten-free person doesn't have a separate dish. What if it's just two of you and one of you is gluten-free? All the recipes call for 4, 6, and 8 servings. So Carol has jumped right into this slot, and we're very grateful she has done this book called Gluten-Free Cooking for Two. So, Carol, welcome to the Food Schmooze Party.
I'm delighted to be with you all.
Oh, it's so nice. So tell me, did you take recipes that you've already, you did 1,000 recipes. Did you take those recipes and then adapt them for two?
Yes, I had a blinding flash of the obvious one day, and I realized in my own life I had been cooking with full-size recipes all my lifetime. And now my husband and I were down to empty nesters, and I was wasting tons of food. You know, like you said before, most recipes are 4 to 6 servings. And I began seeing in the mainstream, there's nothing for gluten-free people who need to eat in 2-serving, 2-portion meals. So, yes, and the recipes in the book, there's 125 of them, are really our family favorites, the things that we eat the most often.
Are you and your mate both gluten-free, or is just one of you gluten-free?
Just me. But he has been having to eat gluten-free with me for about the last 30 years.
Here's my question on that I think is the key to all this as we get to your layered bean tortilla casserole in a cast iron skillet, which we just had here. It was so good. But how do you make dishes gluten-free where they're so good that you don't even have to tell the people at the table that they're gluten-free? How do you make it appealing for your mate as well as yourself?
Well, you have to have the right ingredients, first of all, and I think that we didn't have good ingredients 30 years ago. Now we have much better ingredients. The tortillas that you ate in the dish today, they're wonderful. We have great pastas. We have great flours now that we can use. And so it's a matter of taking the right ingredients and then figuring out the right proportions, and that's really key to balancing the flavors and trying to replicate the flavors that we remember. Mm-hmm. In my case, I grew up eating wheat. I was raised on a wheat farm. Wheat was a predominant food at our table. So I grew up with the flavor of wheat in my taste buds. And that's what's really hard, because our taste buds get accustomed to a certain way. Like, we think bread should taste a certain way, but what we're really tasting is wheat. And so what we gluten-free cooks have to do is rewrite the recipe to use the right blend of flours in this case, the right seasonings, Sometimes we use more seasonings to kind of balance the flavors.
Okay.
It's very interesting, and it's a chemistry project. Each recipe is like a big chemistry project.
Yeah, I like this. I like the architecture of what you're describing. I want to talk with Chris about this layered bean, and all of you here, because we just all ate this together.
Oh, yeah.
Your layered bean tortilla casserole. Think cast iron skillet. It makes 2 servings. This has corn tortillas, a can of black beans, or you could use pinto beans, salsa, fresh or frozen corn, some shredded Monterey Jack cheese, chopped cilantro if you have it, if you like it rather, and then you can use garnishes like sour cream or onion or avocado. So Chris, tell how easy it was.
First, Carol, I love this recipe. I loved it even more last night when I was putting it together. It's A, so simple to make, and B, uses basically everything I already had.
And
My pantry is loaded with this kind of stuff.
And this is on our website right now.
Yeah.
foodschmooze.org. Okay, so tell us how this came together.
It's so easy, it's like mind-blowing. So corn tortillas, you spray or oil the bottom of a cast iron pan, or if you don't have that, you can use a little cake pan. That's what I used. Then you top it with drained and rinsed black beans, a little scoop of salsa. I used the salsa I had in my pantry, grabbed some frozen corn, put a little bit of that on there, and then topped it with cheese. Then another layer goes on, right? Another tortilla, and you do that
like
again.
A lasagna.
Yeah, then you do that again, and then you put another tortilla, and you do it one more time, leaving that open. Then it gets a little cilantro, and you toss it in the oven, covered first to get it nice and toasty, and then you uncover it. It gets nice and crispy on the outside.
Oh, yeah.
Took it out of the oven, let it sit for a couple of minutes, and then cut it into quarters, and oh my God.
It was so delicious.
It is delicious.
Avocado on
kind
top
of
with sour cream. And I mean, it's funny
Have it for
because
brunch.
I didn't have to buy
yeah.
anything to make this.
Yeah, with a little cava with this. Fabulous.
Oh,
That sounds so good. Something else that's great about that recipe is at 4 p.m. on any given day, about 3/4 of us don't even know what we're going to have for dinner that night. And you walk in the kitchen coming home from work like, well, what am I going to do that's quick? This thing can go together so quickly, and you'll have dinner on the table before you know it. And while it's baking, you can make a salad or set the table and all those things you have to do. But that's what I like about it. It's sort of an impromptu dish if you want to use it as one of your backups when you come home and you have nothing planned.
And I like what you say. You could use anything. Right?
Yeah.
Just use this as a template, but if you don't have beans in your pantry, oh well, and use something else.
Oh, sure.
Right? Chicken, shredded chicken, if you had it from
shredded
like
chicken.
before.
Chickpeas.
Whatever.
Yeah,
chickpeas. Whatever you want.
Whatever you want.
You have the tortillas and some cheese. You really can put whatever you want on this
I mean, if you had frozen spinach, if you had
Totally.
frozen peas,
Yeah.
really, just think of what can go in. So, Carol, I want to do something. This is Carol Fenster. Her book is called Gluten-Free Cooking for Two. 125 of her favorites. And I want to try something that is very much in season because sometimes gluten-free eaters are not eating seasonally. They're more eating things they feel deprived of. So there's a lot of a lot of crackers and breads and, but this is not, asparagus soup normally doesn't have any problems with gluten anyway, right? So, but this is a very easy soup using fresh asparagus of the season right now. That was just beautiful. And we put this on the website too, foodschmooze.org. Carol, tell me about this. You use gluten-free chicken or vegetable broth, right?
There's a couple things that usually can go wrong with soups when it comes to gluten-free. One is the broth, because there are brands out there that do have wheat in them still.
Oh.
You got to read the labels, yeah. The other thing that can happen with soups, even though they seem to be sort of safe, is how we thicken them. And so I avoided any major thickeners here. We use sweet rice flour or cornstarch as a thickener, but that's a safe thickener for folks who can't have wheat. I meant this to be a template for any kind of vegetable. So you basically cook the asparagus and the leeks, which add wonderful flavor. And I was back at that point that I mentioned earlier about trying to balance flavors and make sure that things taste just as normal as possible. You simmer that in the gluten-free chicken broth or vegetable broth if you want this to be a vegan or vegetarian dish, and a little bit of salt and pepper, and then whatever herb you like. I'm partial to thyme, but you might use dill, whatever is in season. You simply simmer it till the asparagus and leeks are done, and then you whirl it along with the thickener. You could either use sweet rice flour, which I really like, or cornstarch. And by the way, the sweet rice flour is not the same rice flour that you think of when you see a recipe that says brown rice flour or white rice flour. This is actually sweet rice flour, and it's made from the same sweet rice that you get in Chinese or Asian restaurants, like the stuff that clumps together. It's also called sticky rice, or sometimes, unfortunately, it's called glutinous rice. It doesn't have gluten, but it's called that. You know, that's what we're talking about, and it's easily available through grocery stores.
And why do you like that?
It thickens more like wheat flour does. You know, if you use cornstarch, which is okay, it's a little shinier, more appropriate, I think, for desserts. But in this small amount, you're not going to notice it. If you hold up a dish thickened with wheat flour and then hold it up against one thickened with sweet rice flour, they will look far more alike than the one with cornstarch. Cornstarch lends that kind of glassy, glossy, translucent look that you might not want in a savory dish.
Okay, think about this. Think about how easy it is to make your own asparagus soup, where you've chopped up a leek and just the white parts. Then you've got the chicken broth or vegetable broth, a little tiny bit of butter, salt and pepper, and then the herb thing that Carol's talking about, and that rice flour, sweet rice flour, or if you can't get it, cornstarch. And what happens? You put the saucepan on, and you've got half the broth mixed with the asparagus, the leeks, the butter, the salt, and the pepper, and you bring it to a boil. Let it simmer for a while, covered for about 5 minutes. And these leeks and asparagus are poaching in that broth. So now it's flavored, right? And then with a slotted spoon, you take the asparagus and leek out, and you put it in a blender. And you put the rest of the broth in there with the herbs and the rice flour, and you just puree it for about a minute, and it's incredibly smooth. And now it goes back into the pan, and you cook the soup. You can garnish with a few more leeks if you want, or whatever you want to do. Talk about fresh, seasonal, delicious. I would put some snipped garlic chives on top of that.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
that's on our website, foodschmooze.org, including information about Carol Fenster's book. Carol, it's so hard to know what to talk with you about. There's so many things in here. How about if I don't let you get away, Carol, without talking about...
No problem.
I want you to talk about a dessert. I am a fan of carrot cake. Carrot cupcakes are just the best.
Oh, yeah.
And you have a recipe in here for these. This is, you've got a batter with Carol's gluten-free flour blend of your own design.
Yes.
Granulated sugar, brown sugar, so white and brown, cinnamon, xanthan gum, baking soda, salt, an egg, a little canola oil, crushed pineapple, shredded carrots, sweetened shredded coconut, and some chopped walnuts. Oh, you can see. How can this go wrong?
Yeah. These should be on Easter brunch table.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not someone who puts cream cheese frosting on my carrot cake or my carrot cupcakes. I know. I'm the only one on earth. I like a different frosting, but that's okay. Carol's got a beautiful cream cheese frosting in here for the majority of the people in America. Easy to do, right?
Very easy. I think the reason I put that in the book is, like you, I am a huge carrot cake fan. It's one of those recipes that has a lot of ingredients in it. And the problem with someone who's trying to wing it and convert a large, most carrot cakes are like bundt cake size, huge. Trying to convert your own recipe down to be 2 servings is really, takes a lot of kitchen math. And so I thought this is definitely a recipe that's got to go in the book, because I had to figure out just how much do you use of each ingredient to make all the flavors balance out and the texture be right and, have it look and taste just like the real thing. And then I decided to bake them in cupcakes, because I think cupcakes are the perfect solution when you're cooking for just 2 people. They're automatically proportioned for you. You don't have to cut into a cake and then worry about how do I keep that cake from going stale or drying out. But you make cupcakes, and then you have enough for your one meal, and then maybe a couple left. It makes 6. You would actually have 4 left. But at least you can wrap them and store them.
Can you freeze them without the frosting?
Yeah, definitely. I freeze them all the time.
You could always eat 2 that day.
Well,
Why do you have to have 1?
3, 1 for breakfast.
And don't forget your neighbors.
One at each meal. So one thing I learned is that measuring carefully is really critical in small-scale baking, because the volume is so much smaller. And so whereas in a large full-scale recipe, maybe 1 tablespoon one way or the other isn't going to make that much difference. In a small recipe like this, it can make a huge difference. So I had to get it right.
Yeah.
The end result is carrot cake. What could be better?
Oh, and when you
yeah.
bite into and you get a little nut in there, it's just so delicious.
Walnuts.
Carrot
Now,
cake.
I would never advocate the idea of making two separate things. One dessert for your gluten-free friends and one dessert for yourself. But maybe you're having a party and you really have your heart set on a dessert that is not gluten-free. Go ahead and make that. These cupcakes are easy enough, and I would not mind, in this case, because they are so good, making a separate dessert for my gluten-free friends.
Yeah, but if I'm not gluten-free, I have no problem eating these.
Absolutely.
Right. Yep.
So this is on our website, too, carrot cake cupcakes at foodschmooze.org, including information about your book. Very quickly in this last minute, this is kind of a dirty trick, but you grew up on a wheat farm.
Yeah.
What do you think accounts for the rising numbers of people who have become gluten sensitive or discovered they have celiac, but mostly it's a high level of gluten sensitive people? What do you think is happening?
There's several theories that are posed. One is that we were always there. We just were diagnosed with something else. That's one possible theory. There's been research that's shown, though, out of the Mayo Clinic, that the percentage of people that have celiac disease has actually grown at a very high rate since they were taking data back right after World War II. One of the theories that's advanced by one of our leading doctors, Dr. Fasano, is that there might be something going on with our gut structure. I don't know that anyone knows for sure, and I'm certainly not an expert in the why. It's just that we need gluten-free food, just like a diabetic needs insulin.
As doctors will tell you, people are coming in and saying something is wrong when I eat anything with wheat in it, and they're not making it up. So I'm so glad we had a chance to talk about this. Love your book. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you. You all were delightful to talk with.
Enjoy Colorado.
Bye-bye.
Carol Fenster, author of Gluten-Free Cooking for Two. Thanks, my buddies. We're on WNPR Thursdays at 3 and Saturdays at noon. Weekdays, listen for my 60-second food schmoozes and never eat more than you can lift. In New Haven, I'm Faith Middleton.
Everybody eats when they come to mind.
Thanks for listening to the podcast on your schedule. And when you need a little party in your life, we're here and online all the time at foodschmooze.org. And of course, also on Facebook at Faith Middleton.
This is Hidden Brain. I'm Shankar Vedantam.
All right. And next up, we have Diana shouting out to the Polanski unit.
Hito, it's Mama D. I know I sound kind of different. I'm very sick right now. Got diagnosed with pneumonia. I've been sick already for quite some time now.
This is the voice of a woman calling into a radio show on the Texas station KPFA. She has a personal message for a prison inmate.
Anyway, I want to tell you, Hito, that Mama D loves you. I always think of you. And it's just getting harder and harder. I know I'm not supposed to cry because you're going to get mad at me, but I can't help but feel so much love for you.
Calling into a program like this is one of the few ways for spouses and parents and children to communicate with prisoners, especially inmates in solitary confinement. Many prisoners in solitary have been found guilty of heinous crimes, including murder, rape, terrorism. But here's something you might not know. Some are there because they're difficult to manage or because of bureaucratic inertia. While judges and juries decide whether someone should go to prison, a decision that can be appealed in court, typically it's prison officials who decide whether someone should be in solitary confinement. In recent years, both liberals and conservatives, worried about the psychological and financial costs of long-term solitary confinement, have raised questions about the practice. This week on Hidden Brain, we thought we'd take a look at what happens inside the prison cells that few people ever see and the psychological effects of being alone for long periods of time.
Support for this NPR podcast and the following message come from Blue Apron. Blue Apron partners with sustainable farms, fisheries, and ranchers to bring you all the ingredients you need to create incredible home-cooked meals. Ingredients come paired with an easy-to-follow recipe card delivered to your door weekly in a refrigerated box. Rediscover how fun cooking can be while enjoying specialty ingredients and exploring new flavors and cuisines. Get your first 3 Blue Apron meals free, plus free shipping, by visiting blueapron.com/brain.
Karamat Ryder is a professor of criminology at the University of California, Irvine, and the author of the new book, 23/7, Pelican Bay Prison and the Rise of Long-Term Solitary Confinement. Besides being a researcher, she's also been a prisoners' rights activist at Human Rights Watch. Karamat, welcome to Hidden Brain.
Thanks for having me, Shankar.
You can't tell the story of solitary confinement without understanding the story of a man named George Jackson. He was sent to prison in the early 1960s after pleading guilty to armed robbery, and he was sentenced to a term of 1 year to life. What was the thinking behind this kind of indeterminate sentence?
So the idea for someone like George Jackson was that he would go to prison and he'd have to prove that he'd been rehabilitated before he could get out of prison. Around the time Jackson went to prison, however, people started to look at these indeterminate sentences and realize that they were having truly disproportionate impacts depending on the race of the person with the sentence. So white people had a much easier time convincing prison officials that they had been reformed and should be let out of prison than African-American men like George Jackson happened to be. So George Jackson found himself essentially stuck in prison. Years went by when he was denied parole, and he became radicalized in this process. He wrote a book of best-selling letters that achieved national and international acclaim, letters to his family and to his lawyers, articulating his revolutionary politics and the problems with things like this indeterminate sentence. This brought him to the attention of prison officials, and he was accused of murdering a prison guard in the early 1970s. And he was preemptively sent to death row at San Quentin while he awaited a death penalty trial for that murder he was accused of. And while on death row at San Quentin, in an isolation unit, interestingly, one day his lawyer came in to visit him. And the story that prison officials tell, and that's been repeated many times, is that his lawyer snuck a 9mm gun into him inside of a tape recorder, and that Jackson then used that gun to try to escape from this isolation unit. All we actually know is that he was shot to death on the San Quentin prison yard as he ran out of the isolation unit. And when staff ran into the unit to see what had happened, they found 3 officers and 2 more prisoners who'd been stabbed to death. So this was the most violent day in California's prison history ever, 6 deaths total on August 21st, 1971. And this moment is a moment that people point to in California as incredibly important in understanding why the state needed long-term solitary confinement units. And similar things happened across the U.S., and prison officials in other states point to those moments. So 2 weeks after George Jackson died, the revolt at Attica happened. Similarly, following that, prisoners were locked into their cells, and that became a moment people pointed to as a justification for really long-term solitary confinement.
You also tell the story of a prison administrator, Carl Larson, who began his career the same year that George Jackson went to prison. I understand you interviewed Carl Larson, and his view gives us a glimpse into the other side of the story, how prison guards and prison officials see the need for solitary confinement.
So Carl Larson was one of the earlier people I interviewed in doing this work, and to my surprise, we got to be friends. I came at this work from a perspective of a prisoner's rights advocate, very critical of the system. But as I got to know Carl Larson, I saw that he had a really interesting perspective on the system, and he was one of the first people to point me to the story of George Jackson and to explain how scary it was to be a guard working in the California prisons in the 1970s when these deaths were happening, and to make that fear real for me in a way that helped me to understand why he thought a long-term solitary confinement facility made sense. So Carl Larson is particularly interesting because, as you said, he started out as an officer in the 1970s in California prisons, actually even earlier, and then he worked his way up through the system, becoming a warden, and then becoming head of the prison construction projects that California engaged in the 1980s when the state built one of these long-term solitary confinement supermax facilities. And he takes credit for designing one of the first of these institutions. And that's really interesting because he's a prison administrator. He's not an architect. He's not an expert in exactly what kinds of punishments work. He didn't have a law degree. He had just worked in prisons, and he designed this completely new facility.
I understand that there were some interesting architectural features of this facility, Pelican Bay. The cement for the facility was poured in one large block, and so that the cells were not built in individual units?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that's striking about the place is it's made of these poured concrete cells, so they're incredibly easy to hose down, which is the fact that they can stay clean is important because courts earlier had criticized isolation units for being really dirty. And they're grouped together into these pods of 8, and then the pods of 8 are grouped together again into these tessellated T structures so that one officer can look out over 6 pods of cells at a time. So it's a modern panopticon, and that allows the fact that there are no windows makes it really easy to just fit all these blocks together, if you can imagine that structure.
I'm wondering, Karamat, if you can actually just describe what one of these cells looks like. Give me a sense of what's in the cell, how big it is. What does it actually feel like to be in one of these units?
So the cells in these units are generally about 8 by 10 feet. So imagine a wheelchair-accessible bathroom stall or a generous parking space. Pretty small. You can almost reach from one end of the cell to the other. And they're fairly self-contained. So they contain a poured concrete ledge with a very thin piece of foam over it, and that's the bed. And then there's another sort of concrete bit protruding that is a desk and seat combination. So it's just like a concrete block that a prisoner could sit on and write there. And then there's in another corner, there's a steel, usually toilet sink combination. So it's just, one smooth steel object that has running water and plumbing for the prisoner. Sometimes there are showers in these cells, but generally it's just a sink and a toilet. And again, if the prisoner is lucky and they can afford it and the system they're in allows it, they might have a TV or a radio. And usually they're allowed maybe a few books at a time and a little bit of paper for writing letters or doing legal paperwork.
You say in the book that despite what prison officials say, it's not always the worst of the worst who end up in solitary confinement. But in general, are there patterns to predict who ends up in solitary confinement?
There's been shockingly little research over time on who ends up in solitary confinement and how, and it's very hard to track across states. But as people have paid more attention to this, and through the work I've done, I've started to see some patterns. There's a disproportionate racial impact of solitary confinement. So we know that in our prisons in general, African Americans and Latinos are more likely to be in prison than in the general prison population. They're doubly likely, again, to be in solitary confinement than even the general prison population. And that's often because gang members are being targeted for long-term isolation, especially in states like California. Prison systems are not putting people there based on some act or rule that they broke, but based on their status as dangerous. So prisoners get labeled dangerous gang members and they get sent to isolation indefinitely. In general, I think one way to think about people who end up in isolation is that it's often the people who are really difficult for the system to manage. So that might include seriously mentally ill prisoners. There's recent research showing that transgender prisoners are really likely to end up in isolation, that pregnant women end up there. So people who the system just isn't equipped to provide resources to can end up there also.
So the rise of these institutions coincided in some ways with the decline or closing down of various institutions for the mentally ill, which speaks, of course, to the point that you're just making. But I also understand that this is reflected in the number of suicides we see in solitary confinement compared to the general prison population.
Mm-hmm. There is a very close relationship between solitary confinement and mental illness. One way to understand that is that in the 1970s and early 80s, when mental institutions closed, was the same time that mass incarceration and rates of incarceration were increasing across the United States. And that meant that some mentally ill people, unsurprisingly, ended up in prisons. And one of the arguments I make is that as those people ended up in prison, they tended to be put into solitary confinement. And that's one explanation for the fact fact that rates of suicide in solitary confinement can be twice as high as in the general prison population, or even higher, and that rates of mental illness in isolation can be high. And often there's a real chicken and egg problem of, did a person get sent to isolation because they were mentally ill, and states have tried to limit that, or do people in isolation develop mental illnesses?
Most of us are never going to see the inside of a Supermax, but we often do see scenes of solitary confinement described in pop culture. One of those examples is the TV show Orange is the New Black. We have a bit of tape. The character Piper is put into a security housing unit and starts speaking to a voice she hears through the grate of her cell.
How long have you been down here?
I lost track. I don't know. 9 months? A year?
A year? That's insane.
They keep the lights on, so you lose all sense of time. It's not living. I mean, yeah, you're breathing, but you ain't not a person no more. It's bad. You start to see shit that ain't there. You start to hear voices.
Oh my God.
Keep you here until they break you.
I feel like I'm gonna throw up.
Karamet, I'm wondering how accurate that description is of what life's actually like in solitary confinement.
I do think that the disembodied voice that you hear talking to Piper is accurate on a number of levels. The voice is kind of flattened in affect, and the prisoner was describing hearing voices, hallucinations. That's a very common side effect of isolation. And people talk about time, the way they perceive time changing because there is no way to mark time. People talk about it exactly as that prisoner said. It's not that it even feels long. It's just that it's almost endless. That days can kind of, in a weird, counterintuitive way, fly by because there's nothing marking anything about a day or a week. So in that sense, it's accurate.
I want to spend a moment talking about your own role in looking at this. On the one hand, you're a researcher who has spent time studying the question, but as you yourself have said, you're also a prison rights advocate. You've been an activist at Human Rights Watch and other organizations. How do you preserve your ability to be analytical about the subject while you also have what are very clearly strong views about solitary confinement?
When I went to interview Carl Larson, he said, well, you're a Berkeley liberal. So he asked me to do some background reading and prove that I was serious and I would listen to him. And so I actually think in the process of doing this work, I have become more open-minded and been criticized by advocates for talking so directly and so extensively to prison officials. And so I've had the interesting experience of trying to keep the conversation open across a really broad spectrum of perspectives on this process. And I think in that way, I've been able to try to at least incorporate these different perspectives and tease apart the arguments and the positions people are coming from. And I do think that in reform, prison officials have to walk into these institutions and engage with these prisoners day in and day out, and they also need to be part of the reform conversation. And through this process, surprisingly, even though I came basically from the other side, if you want to think of it in terms of sides, I've come to see that perspective.
When we come back, I'm going to ask Karamet about the psychological toll of solitary confinement and the unexpected ways inmates manage life in isolation. Stay with us.
Support for this podcast and the following message is provided by the 2017 Kia Niro. Here's Kia's Director of Marketing Communications, Kimberly Gardner, on the Niro's driving dynamics.
So many times you have to compromise on something when you look for a car, either design or price or size or, the way it drives. I can't have it all. Well, with the Niro, I feel like when I first drove that vehicle, I thought it's in a very competitive price range. It's big enough for my needs, and it's something that I feel like is going to be really fun on the road. Right off the bat, acceleration was fun. I could feel automatically the vehicle was taking off. I could hear that engine noise. You get that visceral kind of feel, and you can accelerate, on the freeway, and off you go. I don't feel like I have to compromise.
The Kia Niro, a smarter kind of crossover. All warranties and roadside assistance are limited. See retailer for details or go to kia.com/Niro.
This is Hidden Brain. I'm Shankar Vedantam. Karamat, what sorts of things do people in solitary confinement say they miss? What are the kind of things that you miss that the rest of us might not think about?
So people talk about not having seen the moon in years or decades and how much they miss that. And then people talk about missing just pure human touch. And, I tell a story in the book about a prisoner who his cell door and the cell door of the prisoner next to him were accidentally opened at the same time. And they were rival gang members, but they had been talking to each other, shouting through the cell walls. And when the cell doors opened, they just reached around and grabbed each other's hands and held on because it had been so long since either of them had had a gentle human touch like that.
Prisoners often stay alone in their cells for 22 or 23 hours a day, and you found that perhaps the only way to actually manage this psychologically is to stick to a series of very, very rigid routines. Tell me about those routines.
The prisoners who I was able to interview in this research to understand their experiences tended to be the prisoners who survived. And so they did develop all kinds of coping mechanisms. And one of the ones I heard about again and again was that they would wake up, first thing in the morning, 5 a.m., and they would do thousands of repetitive exercises, often what prisoners call burpees. So a combination of jumping jacks, push-ups, and sit-ups. And literally a few thousand in the morning to start out their day, and then clean their cells, write letters, work on legal cases. And in general, in these units, if prisoners are following the rules and they have money being sent in from family, they can buy either a TV or a radio. And prisoners who develop these routines talk about really limiting the time they spent listening to media. So maybe only an hour a day or 2 hours a day or a special show they like to watch, so that they were keeping both their bodies and their minds really busy consciously over the course of a day. And interestingly, prisoners talk about having trouble letting go of these routines once they got out of prison, that they would still do those thousands of burpees every morning at 5 a.m. when they got up, and that their ability to control everything in their space in that 8x10 cell they live in is also hard to let go of, that they could keep, a prisoner described to me how he could keep the cap of his toothpaste perfectly clean, and it was really hard when he had a roommate when he got out of prison, the fact that he couldn't control the cap of the toothpaste anymore. So kind of gives you a sense of how intense it is to survive, and then how long those coping mechanisms linger afterwards.
You talk in the book, Karamat, about inmates trying a number of different things to not just be physically active and mentally active, but emotionally expressive, to try and find ways to do artistic things. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Prisoners do struggle to find ways to express themselves. Sometimes that's becoming really good at the law and litigating cases, but very often it's teaching themselves to draw, sometimes teaching themselves to speak a new language, sometimes teaching themselves to sew. One of my favorite stories was a prisoner who told me that he was in isolation for a number of months, and I'm not even sure how he made himself a needle. I know that he pulled threads out of the jumpsuits they're given in order to make thread, and then he started tailoring his clothes so that they fit better. They're often given these very loose jumpsuits, and so he would add cuffs or shorten the sleeves. And I think other prisoners found out about him doing this, and in some cases a friendly officer would pass a uniform back and forth, and he started tailoring other people's uniforms. It's kind of, not that anyone is even seeing them, but it's this amazing kind of self-expression and community that they're managing to create in this place.
I'm sure there are going to be people who say, look, there are lots of people in these units who really are the worst of the worst. Maybe not all of them are, but some of them probably are. Some of them probably are really violent and really dangerous and ought to be there. And I'm wondering, do you ever feel that they might be people who need to be in solitary confinement?
So there are certainly people in isolation who are dangerous. One of the really important points of analysis is the length of time people are spending in isolation. The fact that people, we're not talking about weeks or months, we're talking about years and decades often, and that even people who might have been fairly scary or dangerous in their 20s are unlikely to be that way into their 40s and 50s. And as we look at decades of these policies, we see that even some of the people who have been held up as the scariest, the system didn't control them very well while they were in it, and they're they're doing surprisingly well outside of isolation. So it really does call the practice into question on all different levels.
So your book comes at a time when many liberals and conservatives have joined hands to call for prison reform. For one thing, keeping people in prison and keeping someone in solitary confinement is very, very expensive. Give us a sense of how expensive it is and whether these ideological pairings are triggering any change in the system.
So solitary confinement is astronomically expensive. In states like California, it costs about $45,000 per prisoner per year to keep someone in the general prison population, and it costs about $90,000 per prisoner per year to keep someone in isolation. So the cost of running the facilities is really expensive because these prisoners in isolation, every need has to be met by someone working in the prison, whether it's delivering mail or delivering legal documents or getting them a meal. So that's how the costs go up. And the costs of the facilities are also expensive to build these kinds of technologically advanced facilities, and that's not even wrapped into that per prisoner per year cost. So I think that has been part of the reform conversation, as you suggest, that perhaps there might be a less expensive way to do this work. One other cost of isolation is that the vast majority of people, even from long-term solitary confinement, ultimately get out of prison. It's 95 to 98% of all prisoners get out eventually, and that's surprisingly true of people in isolation too. And so there's the question of what are the social impacts of letting people out. And I think in combination, those economic costs and the social costs, people are beginning to think about alternatives. And that is a conversation that crosses political lines. And prison, as I suggested in many states, legislators are initiating reforms. Some litigation has happened, but in many states, prison officials within the system are looking at the norms changing and the critiques of this practice and initiating their own reforms, saying, what can we do to reduce our reliance on this practice?
Karamat Ryder is a professor at the University of California at Irvine. She's the author of the book 23/7, Pelican Bay Prison and the Rise of Long-Term Solitary Confinement. Karamat, thank you for joining me on Hidden Brain today.
Thanks for having me.
Hidden Brain is produced by Maggie Penman, Jenny Schmidt, Raina Cohen, Renee Klahr, and Chloe Connolly. Our supervising producer is Tara Boyle. Our unsung hero this week is Debbie Cowan. Debbie is NPR's chief financial officer. She's an unassuming person with a razor-sharp mind. She spends a lot of time thinking about how to generate the revenue to support NPR's journalism. Doing in-depth reporting takes time and costs money, and Debbie will be the first to tell you that you should take a moment to support your local public radio station. Thanks, Debbie. Before we go, we're currently working on a show about gender and jobs. In our rapidly changing economy, a lot of blue-collar jobs are disappearing, and a lot of so-called pink-collar jobs are cropping up. If you're a man who's had to change careers, maybe leave a position at a factory and take up a new job as a home healthcare aide, or if you're a man who's been reluctant to make that kind of transition, we'd love to hear your story. Please call and leave us a message at 661-772-7246. That's 661-77-BRAIN. I'm Shankar Vedantam, and this is NPR.
Hi, it's Rachel Martin with NPR News. And you know what? We're doing something new, and we want you to be part of it. It's called Up First. It's the morning news podcast from NPR. It's a way for you in about 10 minutes or so to get up to speed on the news of any given day. The most important stories, the biggest ideas, the stuff you need to know as you go through your day. Up First, it starts April 5th. You can get it at NPR One or anywhere you listen.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from Massachusetts General Hospital, named the #1 hospital on the East Coast by U.S. News & World Report. Mass General brings together the brightest minds in medicine to push the boundaries of what's possible in healthcare. Learn more at massgeneral.org.
Hey there, it's the NPR Politics Podcast, here to talk about the missile strikes President Trump ordered Thursday night against a Syrian airbase. We're taping this at 2:12 on Friday, and we realize that things may change by the time you listen. Rest assured, we will be back in your feed next week to catch you up on the weekend's developments. So here's what President Trump said last night.
Assad choked out the lives of helpless men, women, and children. It was a slow and brutal death for so many. Even beautiful babies were cruelly murdered in this very barbaric attack. No child of God should ever suffer such horror. Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched.
And the big question, of course, is what happens next. I'm Scott Detrow. I cover Congress for NPR.
I'm Jeff Bennett. I also cover Congress.
And I'm Domenico Montanaro, political editor.
A lot to talk about, and let's just start with the basic facts. This was a strike on an airbase that U.S. officials say is where the recent apparent chemical attacks against Syrian civilians originated from. 59 Tomahawk missiles hit between 3 and 4 a.m. local time Friday morning. Domenico, what else do we know at this point?
Well, those missiles were fired from 2 destroyers in the eastern Mediterranean against an airbase in Syria that the U.S. says is where originated the planes that wound up launching the chemical attack with the chemical weapons that were apparently used. The missiles targeted aircraft shelters, ammunition, air defense systems, and radars. U.S. officials said planners did everything possible to avoid civilian casualties and are still doing battle damage assessments to determine the exact results of the raid.
And, you know, this is a situation where President Trump saw something that horrified him, that horrified the rest of the world. He said he wanted to take action. He asked his military advisors for a range of options. And he made a quick decision all in the course of just a few days.
It was a swift, forceful response to something that was terrible. Everybody who saw this was outraged by it. It was something that President Obama, frankly, was criticized for years ago for not acting.
But I think in terms of this action in this moment versus what comes next, the congressional reaction that we're going to get into tells a lot, because there's basically bipartisan approval of what he did Thursday night. But it really splinters after that because there are a lot of questions of what do you do next? What is the plan?
Right. That's the key thing. Democrats and Republicans say that they support the move. But if it goes any further or if there's a wider action, that's where Democratic reluctance comes in.
One of the questions we were sorting through in the hours after this attack was whether or not the U.S. notified Russia. U.S. officials say they did, in fact, do that. Why does that matter?
The thing is here that Russia has key leverage over Assad and Syria. There are lots of Russian tanks, military personnel, aircraft in Syria. So the United States wanted to give Russia at least a heads up to be able to say, get out of the way before they went in to bomb there, because the last thing the United States wants to do is get into a shooting war or some kind of conflict with Russia. And we saw today the Russian reaction, pretty hot against the United States. There was a line that they had set up to deconflict. In other words, if the United States was going to take an action where there could be Russian troops or vice versa, that they could warn each other. That's what they did. It's not like President Trump called up Vladimir Putin and said, I'm doing this. It's that they have this open line that now the Russians say they're cutting off.
Okay. So a lot of reaction in our realm of the world as well, the political realm of the world. And Jeff, you have been tracking this on Capitol Hill since the attack itself. A lot of different areas of response that are worth talking through. So let's go one at a time. What's the response been to the attack itself?
Well, lawmakers in both parties have been largely supportive of the strikes. Mitch McConnell, the top Republican in the Senate, said he, quote, very much approved of what the president did. But you're also hearing praise, thinly veiled praise, I guess, from left-leaning Democrats and party leaders, including Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, Elizabeth Warren. They've also signaled support for Trump's actions, in many ways giving the president political cover. I mean, Chuck Schumer said on the Senate floor, it's the right thing to do.
Making sure that Assad knows when he commits such despicable atrocities, he will pay a price is the right thing to do.
There is this element that we are seeing from some Democrats, including people like Tammy Duckworth, the Democrat from Illinois, and Chris Murphy, the Democrat from Connecticut, that if Trump really cared about Syrian children, he wouldn't have a ban that prevents them from coming into the U.S.
Right.
And there was this statement that Chris Murphy released where he said a solitary airstrike exposes the immoral hypocrisy of this administration's policy in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think let's hold off on that conversation later, because I think that's a big part of the questions we have about how President Trump kind of came to this decision and what happens next. But in terms of what people are saying on the Hill, So by and large, generally bipartisan agreement that this isolated event was the right thing to do. But it kind of scatters after that. And one big question is, did Trump have authority to do this, and would there need to be some sort of congressional approval for additional action?
That's right. I mean, to hear some members of Congress tell it, President Trump's decision to launch this missile strike is illegal because Congress is the only branch of government that can authorize war. And President Trump, like President Obama before him, has launched airstrikes against ISIS targets using as a legal justification this 2001 war authorization that Congress passed after the September 11th attacks. But lawmakers are split over whether that justification covers attacks against the Assad government. And there is this notion that we've heard from Democrats and some Republicans, particularly the Libertarian Rand Paul, that as this strategy develops, if this is more than just a one-off thing, the president will need to consult Congress.
Yeah, and that's the big point, right? I mean, because there's support for limited engagement. Democrats, even reluctantly, Democrats came out and said that they were at least supportive at this point of what President Trump wanted to do. But everyone's kind of confused as to what the strategy is. If there is a strategy, what does this mean? Because it's very difficult to square Donald Trump's America First policy, his Syrian refugee ban. Mm-hmm. You know, he seems to have been moved by these images, as he called it, of beautiful babies that were subject to nerve damage, apparently, by what had happened. And because he was able to see that on cable news, he seemed moved by it. He wasn't moved by it in 2012, moved by it this time around. If they were to take broader action, as Jeff pointed out, they're going to need broader congressional approval.
One more thing on Congress before we get into all of that. It's worth pointing out, we pointed this out yesterday when we were talking kind of hypothetically about if something like this would happen when we were taping our weekly roundup. When it comes to Congress authorizing force in Syria, a big part of the order of events when President Obama made that threat about chemical weapons in Syria and ended up not doing any sort of attacks was that he asked Congress to pass an authorization, and Congress didn't have the votes to do that. There wasn't the will in Congress at that point in time. I mean, how much has changed between now and then?
Well, because they felt burned because of the unpopular Iraq war, and there was a great deal of animus for President Obama himself. But you have to imagine that if Trump went to a Republican Congress and asked for a broad authorization of military force, I would expect that Congress, by and large, would be willing to give it to him. I don't know if there are enough hawks in the party alone to support that. And, of course, there are people who, members of Congress who want him to articulate a clear strategy. But I do think the tides have turned significantly in the president's favor, at least politically, as it relates to this.
Domenico, you talked about all the big questions and how this kind of veers from a lot of what Trump has been saying for a while. And I think that's what all of us are trying to figure out. So let's tee this up and listen to some sound from the last year or so to make sense of this before we try and hash this out. So two big picture questions, I think, that we're all working through. How did this happen? How did this happen so quickly? What comes next? So if you go back to the beginning, what's really remarkable here is how this sort of intervention is something that both President Trump and key members of his administration had shown zero interest in. Even looking past Trump's past statements on Syria, a lot of his 2013 tweets have been floating around. Let's just listen to what he said earlier this week.
I'm not, and I don't want to be, the president of the world. I'm the president of the United States. And from now on, it's going to be America first.
And on Syria, Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, said this just a few days ago.
I think the status and the longer term status of President Assad will be decided by the Syrian people.
And then suddenly yesterday,
Assad's role in the future is uncertain, clearly, and with the acts that he has taken, it would seem that there would be no role for him to govern the Syrian people.
And of course, during the campaign, a common thing that Trump said was that, if Hillary Clinton is elected, she's going to want to have a shooting war in Syria, and that could lead to World War III.
With her plan, you'll end up in World War III with Syria. Steve, you're going to end up in World War III over Syria if we listen to Hillary Clinton. She's incompetent.
So how did this all change so quickly?
It's like the world began when Trump became president. Like none of the stuff that Assad had done in the past that had already developed his character, that Trump didn't appear offended by back then, only started January 20th, because in 2012, when Assad pulled this chemical attack and President Obama didn't act on his red line, it was seen as maybe Obama's weakest moment when it came to foreign policy because he didn't act. Donald Trump, when he was a private citizen, just tweeted out then and said, don't go into Syria. You need congressional approval to go into Syria. It's not worth the cost. All of those same things that were happening to Syrians with the chemical attack then that happened the other day were happening back then.
Jeff?
Yeah, there are a couple things really that I think are in the mix here. One, it had to have entered into his calculations that if he were to do nothing, he would have ended up looking like Barack Obama. So the need to appear different and to have a force of strength, I think, was a strong motivator. Two, because this president has been in trouble politically for the past few weeks or months, this was also a distraction. Not to sound cynical, but I do think that is certainly the case. But, military analysts, military folks will tell you that the first strike is always the easiest one. Coming up with a strategy, coming up with a policy that informs that strategy is a much heavier lift. So, as we've been talking about, we're all waiting to see what comes next, if anything, as it relates to the president's approach to Syria.
I think the key thing here is the other day, President Trump said, I have responsibility.
I now have responsibility, and I will have that responsibility and carry it very proudly. I will tell you that. It is now my responsibility. It was a great opportunity.
And he realized the weight of this and the decision he would have to make. I think the confusion comes in for a lot of people because Hillary Clinton probably would have taken the same action.
She would have, because actually, I think just in the last 24 hours, she advocated this exact approach.
I really believe that we should have and still should take out his airfields and prevent him from being able to use them to bomb innocent people and drop sarin gas on them.
Now, that's not surprising at all that hours later, actually, President Trump wound up taking the same action. But it wasn't surprising from Hillary Clinton because this is what she laid out during the campaign. She actually called to go further. She called for no-fly zones. We know that when she was Secretary of State that she wanted tougher action to arm the Syrian rebels that were in a stronger position back then, and that President Obama was cautious about and didn't want to do because he maybe was overlearning the lessons of George W. Bush and not wanting to nation build and get bogged down in a country when there wasn't a big multilateral effort to help in that country. So you're seeing President Trump now try to make this move, but a lot of people confused about what would be coming next and why he made this decision when it really runs contrary to some of what he had talked about during the campaign and how he wanted to be unpredictable.
Jeff, I know you've got to hop off the line in about a minute or so because you're on deadline. But in terms of what's next, do we have a sense of what comes next in Congress other than just people like us asking congressmen what they think about this whole thing?
Well, certainly, as this strategy takes shape, members of Congress, Republican and Democrat alike, want to have some say in it. I think the question that was on the minds of many members that we spoke to today was, have we seen President Trump's red line, the use of chemical weapons? He's already taken an action. Does he repeat it every time Assad uses weapons or some sort of brute force on his own people? The fact that President Obama articulated a red line and then didn't follow up, that was the essence of the policy failure in that regard. So I think on those two issues, the strategy and then whether he consults Congress or what we're waiting to see next.
And I think one of the tricky dynamics, and again, we've said this before, is that, this is not a good guys, bad guys scenario by and large when it comes to all the players in Syria. If we went down a line where the United States was actively pushing for regime change with Bashar al-Assad, it seems like ISIS would actually be the people who would benefit from that the most, and that's clearly not what the United States wants. So then you have Russia and Iran both being very interested in what happens here as well. It's an area where the president needs to tread very lightly in terms of strategic decisions.
The thing that I keep coming back to is before this chemical attack happened, his administration had notably shifted away from the Assad must go language just a couple days ago, saying that was not the focus. Nikki Haley, Rex Tillerson, his Secretary of State, Sean Spicer, the White House press secretary, saying it's a political reality that Assad is in power at this point, that's not the focus, that ISIS is the focus. You saw President Trump this week meet with al-Sisi from Egypt, somebody who President Obama wouldn't meet with because of allegations of human rights abuses. He came to power in a military coup, in a bloody military coup, allegations of kidnapping, torture, jailing of dissidents. And then Trump legitimized him, brought him into the White House, said the United States is a strong backer of Egypt. And that is something that squares very much with Vladimir Putin's view of the world. He said the Arab Spring was a problem because it destabilized a lot of countries in the region. Syria and Assad you may not agree with, Sisi and Egypt you may not agree with, but they bring stabilization. Trump seemed to be moving toward that. Does this attack now mean Trump is moving in the other direction?
Jeff, before you go and write your story, anything else you want to add on all of this?
My main takeaway, and this is probably fairly obvious, but I still think it's particularly resonant, is that we now see that President Trump is willing to take military action with far less hesitation than President Obama ever did. And I'm interested to see how that informs the rest of his time in office.
All right. Well, Jeff Bennett, thanks for joining us from Congress.
Thank you.
Good luck with that all things considered story.
See you, Jeff.
Good luck.
Bye.
Domenico, one thing that I keep coming back to, and I genuinely don't know the answer, is that chemical weapons are this thing that, by and large, the international community says, you cannot use those at all. But anyone who paid attention to Syria over the last few years has seen atrocity after atrocity after atrocity, entire city blocks being leveled, these cluster bombs that are completely indiscriminate. So why is this that much worse than all the other death and destruction that has been going on for so long from the government towards its own people?
Well, first of all, chemical weapons has always been the kind of thing that is a red line. The President Obama talked about a red line and chemical weapons, but that was always even a justification for the Iraq War, that Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons against his own people in 1988, that George W. Bush and the Bush administration was able to say, look, he's probably got a cache of this stuff somewhere.
Which, of course, he did not.
He did not, or at least wasn't able to be found. WMD, weapons of mass destruction. So chemical weapons have always been an international thing that the United Nations, others have said is a big no-go. The other big part of it is we know President Trump is somebody who watches a lot of cable news. Yeah. And it's very difficult to see the images, the horrific images of children being put on stretchers or put into ambulances who couldn't move. So to see those images, for an American people to see those images, that makes a big difference. And before we dismiss the power of those kinds of images turned around the Vietnam War. If you didn't have reporting and images coming out of Vietnam, you wouldn't have had people in the streets, most likely, to try to change the dynamic there.
And even Syria, the high point of international interest over the last few years was in the wake of those terrible pictures of that boy being washed ashore, that refugee.
Right.
But I think one important thing to look for over the next few days is if the Trump administration is now moved to kind of advocate for the Syrian victims of this war, how does that square with an executive order that straight up said that refugees from Syria are not welcome in the United States?
If that's the case. And it's not just the refugee ban. It's what do you do about the Syrian civil war? I mean, that is the big issue. And again, chemical weapons is one thing, but people by the thousands and millions have been affected by the violence from the Assad government to his own people.
I think one thing that sticks with me through all of this as well is that throughout the course of the campaign, seeing the way that Donald Trump presented himself, seeing the way that he gave interviews, the way he gave speeches, kind of being off the cuff, never scripted. Once he was elected, the thing that I could just never fully envision was him in this setting where you're formally sitting behind a desk or standing behind a lectern, giving an address to the nation about a military attack you ordered.
Well, and you saw that last night. He's president of the United States. Every president takes some kind of military action. He's always influenced by external events in ways that he could never perceive or understand were going to be likely. We should also say that this happens to come at a point where Trump was at a low point, at an inflection point, really, in his presidency. It was been marred by chaos in his White House, a lack of action on his domestic agenda. Between this bombing, which his team is now painting as a leadership moment, and the approval of Neil Gorsuch to be Trump's nominee for the Supreme Court, he's hoping to put his presidency back on track.
Just a few notes before we go. One thing that happened today, we've been talking about it for a while. It happened today. It is now done. Neil Gorsuch officially confirmed as an associate justice on the Supreme Court. The final Senate vote this morning, 54-45. When Gorsuch is sworn in by Chief Justice John Roberts, the court will have a full bench of 9 members for the first time since February 2016. Okay, that's a wrap for today and for this week. We'll be back in your feed next week. A few more notes. We've been plugging NPR's new morning news podcast, Up First. Make sure to grab their latest episode first thing Monday morning. They record it at 5. The post is up at 6, so you'll know what happened overnight. You'll often hear some of us on there as well. Domenico, you were on there a couple times this week. What'd you think?
I was. A lot of fun. Always glad to do it. And I think you're getting a taste of it on Monday, right?
I am. Monday will be my first time on Up First.
Awesome.
Finally, a crazy week like this may make you think about how much you value the news. NPR and your local public radio station are out there covering all of this every day, helping you make sense of it. You can support the work we all do in partnership with each other by supporting your local public radio station. Go to npr.org/stations, donate, and tell them we sent you. Thank you to all of you who've done that in the past. I'm Scott Detrow. I cover Congress.
And I'm Domenico Montanaro, political editor.
And Jeff Bennett joined us earlier. Thank you for listening to the NPR Politics Podcast.
This is GCRadio101FM. This is where music and the word come alive. This is GCRadio101FM. This is where music and the word come alive.
The river of life, you will find healing here.
Oh, yes, you will.
Come to the river of life, come and drink freely here. Come if your heart is searching, oh, come if your soul is thirsty. Draw near and drink of the mercy of Jesus Christ. Oh yes, at the river of life. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the city of God. So come if you're wounded or sad, there is a river.
Oh, yes, there is.
There is a river. Oh, yeah. Come to the river of life. You will find healing here.
Yes, you will.
Come to the river of life. Come and drink freely here. Come if your heart is searching. Come if your soul is thirsty. Draw near and drink of the mercy of Jesus Christ. Oh yes, at the river of life. It flows from the land of eternal life, where there's no more sorrow and no more night. The hearts that are lifted to Him, filling His children again and again and again. Oh, come to the river of life, you will find healing here.
Oh, yes.
Come to the river of life, come and drink freely here. Come if your heart is searching. Oh, come if your soul is thirsty. Draw near and drink of the mercy of Jesus Christ. At the river of life. Jesus Christ at the river of life. Oh, there is a river tonight. Yes, there is. Whose streams make glad the city of God. There is a river flowing from the throne of God. Oh, there is a river. Come and drink freely from that river. Oh, yes, there is. Oh, there's a river tonight, flowing freely from the throne of God. Come and drink freely. Come and drink freely. Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. There is a river. There is a river. There is a river.
Satisfy my soul like you. Who on earth can comfort me and love me like you do? Who could ever be more faithful and true? I will trust in you. I will trust in you, my God. Who can satisfy my soul like you? Who on earth can comfort me and love me like you do? Who could ever be more faithful and true? See, I will trust in you. I will trust in you, my God. Redeemer, who reigns. find my place. As long as I'm alive to glorify his holy name. Ain't no ride gonna cry in my place. As long as I'm alive to glorify his holy name. Praise the Lord, praise his name. As long as I'm alive to glorify his holy name. Praise the Lord, praise his name. As long as I'm alive to glorify his holy name. Ain't no bird gonna sing in my place. As long as I'm alive to glorify his holy name. Ain't no bird gonna sing in my place. As long as I'm alive to glorify his holy name. Praise the Lord, praise his name. As long as I'm alive to glorify his holy name. Yeah, yeah. Praise the Lord, praise his name. As long as I'm alive to glorify his holy name. Ain't no tree gonna clap in my place. As long as I'm alive to glorify his holy name. Yes, sir. Ain't no tree gonna clap in my place. As long as I'm alive to glorify his holy name. His holy name. Sing it. Praise the Lord. Praise his name. As long as I'm alive to glorify his holy name. Sing it again, sing. Praise the Lord. We will. Praise his name. As long as I'm alive.